You're listening to an encore presentation of Life Talk with Wade Sorochan. Highlights of previous shows featuring special guests and open line discussions. Since this is a pre-recorded presentation, please do not call. And now, Life Talk with Wade Sorochan on AM 930, The Light.
And we're talking with Lord Christopher Monckton, renowned climate change skeptic. And your thoughts, where do you stand on the issue of climate change? Lord Monckton, a lot of talk about the polar ice cap. It's melting. Reports say it's lost maybe up to 25%, causing enormous flooding just recently. Is that not evidence that global warming is real?
No, it isn't. It's evidence that there was, in 2007, a temporary warming of the Arctic only. And indeed, the Arctic ice cap, even if it melted away entirely, would not add a single millimeter to sea level rise because it's floating. It's only the Antarctic that might cause sea level rise if it were to melt. The Arctic ice cap is harmless to sea level rise, and it lost about 27% of the ice you would normally expect to find there at the summer minimum. But the Arctic has a highly volatile climate. It was actually warmer in the Arctic by 1 or 2 degrees Celsius than it is today in the 1930s and early 40s. And so, as you might have expected, once there was that sea ice minimum in the Arctic, it was a 30-year minimum. We'd never seen anything like it for 30 years. It recovered in each of the following 2 years, so that in September this year, at its minimum, it was more or less back to normal, though you won't see that reported anywhere. The other thing about that September 2007 30-year sea ice minimum in the Arctic, it was followed 3 weeks later by a 30-year sea ice maximum in the Antarctic, where there was more sea ice than had ever been seen since the satellites first went up there 30 years ago. So we know, therefore, that the sea ice disappearing temporarily from the Arctic was purely a local and regional phenomenon. It wasn't anything to do with global warming. It was caused, as NASA said in a paper the following year, by unusually strong warm currents coming up from the tropics of both air and water. Nothing unusual in that. It happens from time to time, and the Arctic just behaves like that. There's been no significant loss of ice in Greenland, though there are some who are trying to pretend that there has. Likewise, West Antarctica. Overall, the ice extent, sea ice extent, of the world has remained more or less static for 30 years. That's the true facts, but you won't see those in the mainstream media because they're frankly not exciting enough.
All right, well, let's take some more calls. Let's welcome Joseph to the program. Joseph, welcome.
Yes, hi, Wade, and hello, Lord Christopher Monckton. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Joseph, a real pleasure. What's your question?
Well, last week you did an interview with Alex Jones, and I'm going to quote you if you'll allow me. You said, "So it's up to you now. You only have 10 days left of being a free country with a constitution of your own, because once he," and you were speaking of Obama, "once he signs that treaty, once that happens, then it's bye-bye to your constitution. It's bye-bye to the freedom which America has long been a beacon to the world. You are now in immediate peril of losing that freedom." Now, my question is, if world leaders sign this Copenhagen Treaty, which you have warned allows for a global government, how would the treaty's implication affect the democratic freedoms of Canada and the United States?
Good question, Joseph.
That's an excellent question, and the answer is this, that what is being proposed, they're no longer calling it a government, incidentally. They've taken that word out of the treaty, but they haven't taken out the bureaucratic structures that would go with it. 700 new bureaucracies, all paid for by taxpayers, and having enormous powers, first of all, to levy taxes equivalent to half of the U.S. defense budget in the U.S. and probably something similar in Canada, too. They also have the power to levy a 2% tax on every financial transaction into and out of Canada, the United States, and other prosperous Western countries. Of course, it's only the Western countries that are going to be made to pay for all this, because the idea is that we are having to make these payments, so-called reparation, for imagined and largely imaginary climate debt, because we've been burning fossil fuels to emit CO2 far more than anybody else has until now. And so the idea is to point this treaty at the West, and it's basically to extract a large amount of money from us to go to this new world government with its interlocking bureaucracies spreading throughout the world.
So how do you think...
those bureaucracies will have the power to intervene directly, not only in the environmental affairs of all nations, but also in their economic affairs. Now, the old rule used to be no taxation without representation, but now you'll be taxed by an alien central governmental power, and of course the word election, ballot, democracy or vote does not appear anywhere in any of the drafts of this treaty.
Okay, well, Joseph, go ahead.
So how will these taxes and these new measures, how will they be enforced?
They have a provision in the treaty for enforcement under what is coyly called a facilitative mechanism. And this is yet another series of bureaucracies working with the main bureaucracy, which will have the power to intervene directly and help themselves to money from your national treasury, and you won't be able to stop that money going out. They will have the right to do that, and any country that finds a way of resisting them and stopping them from just helping themselves for whatever money they feel like out of your treasury can be subjected to unlimited fines and other penalties by the international community. So they have thought long and hard about how to enforce this, and they have a series of extremely unpleasant and very powerful ways of doing so. So whatever you do, don't sign this agreement in the hope that it won't apply to you or you can get out of it later, because they have thought of that, and they're going to be very fierce this time.
Joseph, thank you for your call. How much pressure is on governments to come up with an agreement in Copenhagen?
Well, I think, frankly, that thanks to ClimateGate, the revelation that these bogus emails have been circulating, and we now know that the scientists who are behind all this have been making the science up effectively, I think the pressure has come off governments if they were only to realize this. It's now understood that we don't have the problem that everybody had been told we did have. And now that this is more generally known, I don't think there is much political pressure on governments. I think certainly, of course, the likes of Greenpeace and the Environmental Defence Fund and the World Fund for Nature and all these other huge organisations. Greenpeace now has a navy larger than the British Navy. I mean, they've got serious money behind them. Goodness knows where they're getting from. They're not getting it from the pennies of ordinary members. I just hope they're not getting it from China and other governments that want to shut us down by getting us to close down our economies from within. But these very rich organisations, they will continue to put pressure on governments. They're all here with their hordes of chanting zombies. But the fact is that I think in reality, if governments were to come back and say, well, actually the scare is now over, we really don't believe in this anymore, the people would shrug and say, fine, on to the next thing. That at least means we won't have to pay a lot of completely unnecessary taxes. So I think now the time has come for governments to come off the Kool-Aid and realize that even if it ever was popular to believe in this global warming rubbish, it certainly isn't popular now after ClimateGate, now that we know the whole thing's bogus. And so government to have to, at least in the democratic countries, actually listen to their peoples and change their view or be out of office.
And we're talking about climate change. Lord Christopher Monckton, renowned climate change skeptic. More of your calls in a moment. But first, Lord Monckton, even if climate change, the theory, isn't 100% accurate, isn't it better still to do something to be good stewards of our planet?
Then I think we go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Where we are given dominion over all the creatures of the earth and in the sea and above the earth. And that dominion carries with it responsibility. And of course, we must exercise responsible stewardship of the planet which we have been given the care of. And nobody, therefore, says that we should go around wrecking or raping the planet or just for profit and elbowing out the fragile plants and creatures that share it with us. That would not be right, and that would not be good stewardship. However, what we mustn't do is to waste the money that could be spent on dealing with real environmental problems by devoting it on the non-environmental problem of CO2 emissions. And here is why. Because if you say, well, why don't we just take precautions anyway? Surely that's not going to do any harm. That so-called precautionary principle can do harm unless you apply the precautionary principle to the precautions themselves. I'm going to give you an example.
Okay.
What we did was we decided, the world decided quite wrongly, that we needed to grow biofuels instead of food. So a third of the agricultural land of the United States, something similar in Canada, taken out of agricultural production, no longer growing food for people who need it. Now it's growing biofuels for clunkers that don't. This happened worldwide because the world got together and said, carbon dioxide, terrible problem. Let's grow biofuels instead of digging the oil out of the ground. That's going to emit less CO2. It doesn't actually, but that was the storyline. And so they did this, and they did it all around the world. The result was that food became scarce, food prices doubled. And okay, if that means you pay $2 for a burger instead of $1, it's inconvenient for us in the rich countries. In a poor country, if you like Haiti, where they live on mud pies costing 3 cents each, made with real mud, that's all they've got to live on, and suddenly the mud pie becomes 6 cents and they can't afford it, they die. And there have been major food riots in a dozen regions of the world over the last 2 years, hardly reported at all in any Western major news medium. And these food riots mark millions of deaths by starvation, derived directly from the policies designed to address this non-problem of climate change. So it is very, very, very important that if you're going to make policies in this field, you make sure that your policies do not do harm. That's the ancient principle from Hippocrates, one of the earliest doctors. Primum non nocere. First of all, do not do harm. And the policies being advocated and practiced already around the world to try to address this non-problem of climate change are killing people in the millions by one of the most unpleasant deaths known, which is starvation.
All right.
And we ought to be ashamed.
All right, let's get back to more calls here from Evansburg. Barb, you're on with Lord Monkton.
Hi there.
Hi.
I was listening to Coast to Coast last night and early morning, and Grant Jeffries was on there. And he was referring to the document that they're trying to get signed down there at the Copenhagen, big meeting down there.
Yep.
Yes.
And he said that there's something very, very important on page 16, and some section on that page 16 that's referring to a reduction of 95% over here in Canada and United States. And he mentioned something about that would just eliminate totally all our industry and everything that we're doing. And I was kind of wondering if there's any way, if that can be checked out.
Is that true? Is that true, Lord Monkton, that they're on page 6?
Yes, that was in the first draft of the treaty, that they were aiming for a 95% reduction in the amount of carbon dioxide emitted by the industries of the West. That would indeed pretty much shut down the US and Canadian economies completely. And it is astonishing that after several negotiating rounds, that figure is still in the treaty draft. And you're quite right, it is sheer lunacy. Here are we proposing to close down pretty much entirely the economies of the West for the sake of a non-problem. And all of this because there are forces that have long hated the democracy, freedom and prosperity and sheer success and fun of being in the West. People around the world who hate and resent it and want it to stop. And if they can persuade us in the name of this bogus scare about the planet to shut our own economies down, that is what they will do. And you're quite right, that figure of 95% is actually in the draft. And I can tell you why it is. And here's the sum. They've worked out that if you want to reduce global warming, you have to stop emitting CO2, obviously. Well, how much CO2 do we emit? We emit enough to put up the concentration in the atmosphere by just 2 parts per million per year. There are 388 parts per million in the atmosphere at the moment. So the warming you would get from 1 year of shutting down the entire world economy, the warming you would prevent if you shut down all the world economy for a year, would be just 1/40th of a Celsius degree. It's 4.7 times the natural logarithm of 390 over 388. That's how you do the sum. 4.7 times the natural logarithm of 390 over 388 equals 0.024 Celsius degrees. So anyone who tells you there's a hurry about this, it's going to be terrible because if we don't do something now, the planet will fry. No, all you'll get, even if the UN's exaggerated estimate of CO2's influence on the climate is right, is 1/40th of a degree Celsius of warming for each year in which you do absolutely nothing about it. So it's not a problem, but of course that works the other way against you. If you're trying to stop warming from happening, then you would have to shut down the entire economy of the world for 41 years to forestall just 1 Celsius degree of temperature increase. And of course that is such a stupid mismatch between the staggering death and destruction that would be caused by closing down the whole world economy for that long, and the tiny benefit, even if the UN was right, of reducing the temperature by just 1 degree. But actually, they've multiplied the effect of CO2 on the climate by about 6. So you might even be looking at only 1/6 of a Celsius degree forestalled in 40 years of shutting down the whole economy. That's why that figure of 95% is in there. Yeah. They know that there isn't a big problem, and even if there were, economically speaking, you can do nothing about it except by closing down the entire world economy. Once people realize that, they realize how pointless this whole Copenhagen exercise is.
So, Barb, where do you stand on the whole issue of climate change?
I think it's a big hoax, and I'm hoping seriously that our Prime Minister doesn't just let anybody read that document and take their word for it, and that they miss that clause, and then he makes a decision not based on all the information.
Yeah, absolutely. Barb, thank you for your call. Let's talk to Bill. Hello, Bill.
Yeah, I read that CO2 is actually so beneficial to plants. Some greenhouses actually pay extra to pump CO2 into the greenhouse. And just the whole idea that maybe the science is so far off that the CO2 is helping perhaps delay an ice age. I don't know, but it's interesting. Just it could be the other way altogether.
Yes, I think you're quite right, Bill. CO2 is extremely good for plants. Indeed, experiments have been done by giving CO2 to plants at 10,000 parts per million, and they love it. They can't get enough of it. The more CO2 you give them, the more they like it, within reason. Yep. So there's certainly no reason not to increase CO2 because, for instance, if you double the CO2 in the atmosphere from what it was in the year 2000, so that by 2100 we might have doubled the CO2 in the atmosphere, that will increase crop yields on its own by 41%. By 2/5, you will increase the yield of crops, of grain in particular. And it also helps tree growth. The U.S. Forest Service has been keeping figures on this. Even the rarest and most fragile of orchids, they too are forced in greenhouses with concentrations of up to 10,000 parts per million of CO2, where there's only 400 parts per million, or actually only 388 parts per million in the atmosphere at the moment as a whole. So yes, you're quite right, CO2 is highly beneficial, and Will Happer, who's an eminent professor at Princeton, giving testimony in front of the U.S. Congress earlier this year, said there is a shortage of CO2 in the atmosphere. Plants need more of it. Wow. And
just
we should not be frightened of allowing more of it to be emitted.
Okay, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, just a related question. I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard of the documentary Demographic Winter. And have you ever looked into that issue?
Not really, no. Are you talking of a sudden population decline coming in 2050? Or what?
Well, yeah, population decline, especially in countries like Japan and in Europe, and it's another side of the issue.
Yes, that's quite right. One of the things that I think has been very little understood is that as countries become more prosperous, their populations don't increase, they fall. And that's because once people become prosperous, there are other things to do with their time than make children, putting it crudely. And so what happens, therefore, is that populations stabilize as they become richer. And therefore, if you want to stabilize the population, which is actually a sensible thing to do, because that means we can then really address poverty, you need to lift people out of poverty. That stabilizes the population, enables them to stay out of poverty.
Yeah, and then
the fastest way to lift them out of poverty is to let them burn fossil fuels and have electricity.
Okay, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, just one general observation. Was interesting statistic. 70% of the planet Earth is ocean, and for humans on the planet to make an impact on global climate when they're not living on the ocean, I don't think so.
Yeah, Bill, thank you for your call.
Quite right. The answer is that there's so little CO2 in the oceans anyway that one thing you're not going to get, for instance, is acidification of the ocean. Because even if we were to double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, but then all of that ended up in the oceans, which is a totally impossible equation, but let's suppose that happened, then the amount of CO2 in the oceans would rise by little more than just 1%. And because CO2 is present in such small quantities in the oceans, that wouldn't be enough to make any difference to its acidification. It's just completely out of proportion. And all honest scientists know it. So you're quite right. Our impact on the planet, we do only exist largely on the land. And even there, our impact is so small that, yes, we've increased the proportion of CO2 in the atmosphere by 1 part in 10,000 of the atmosphere in the last 250 years, and we might increase it by another 1 part in 2,000 of the atmosphere over the next 100 years if we try really hard.
Lord,
that is all. It's not enough to change the climate.
Lord Moncton, our time is, I know it's after midnight there, and I really appreciate your time on the program today. If we could just hold you for just a couple minutes, I just want to ask you one final question when we come back.
Sure.
And I just want to ask you, what do you think will happen to our climate in the next 100 years? And also, in your opinion, what do you see happening if there is a unified agreement in Copenhagen? Can we address those two questions as we wrap up in a moment?
Certainly.
I really appreciate that. Lord Christopher Moncton, renowned climate change skeptic, will answer those questions when we come back.